Good morning, everyone. Welcome. My name is Tina Mylly, and I am the moderator for today's webinar. I work for the OCHA UNDP-led Connecting Business Initiative that supports the integration of the private sector international and international coordination mechanisms. We want to make sure that businesses, also local SMEs, can play a role in preparing for, responding to, and recovering from crisis. We're co-hosting this webinar today with OCHA, the UN Global Compact, and the Global Compact Network Ukraine. A few logistical notes before we get started. So first, we do have Ukrainian interpretation available. So most likely at the bottom of the menu, you will see a button that says interpretation, and you can choose either the English or the Ukrainian channel. Most presentations will be in English. Tatiana from the Global Compact Network Ukraine will be speaking in Ukrainian. So if you do not understand Ukrainian, you may want to choose the English channel. All participants are muted. We do this only to minimize any background noise, but we do have a lot of time at the end for discussion, and we do hope that you can already start submitting questions when they pop in your heads. So you can go to the Q&A box and type your questions there. So we have all of them in one place. You can use the chat box still for other kind of introductions and comments, but it's easier if we have all the questions in the Q&A box. Maybe lastly, just to mention that we will share the presentation and the materials, the recording with everyone after the session. Next slide, please. So this webinar is the second of a series of three. Today, we will talk about the UN system, but more specifically, the humanitarian coordination structures in Ukraine. The last webinar, which will be next week on Thursday, the 23rd, will explore the principles and the standards that govern humanitarian response and why and how are those relevant also to the private sector. So today we'll start with brief opening remarks from the Executive Director of the Global Compact Network in Ukraine, Tatiana Saharuk. Then James Wetherill, who is the Deputy Head of Office at OCHA Ukraine, will provide an overview of the humanitarian architecture and the response so far. After him, Karim El-Bayar will tell us about the Ukraine Private Sector Donations Tracker, a platform where we also hope to showcase the support you have provided for the response. Lastly, as mentioned, we have a lot of time for questions and answers before we close the webinar at 11 a.m. Ukraine time. Now, before I invite Tatiana to take the floor, I would like to take just 1 minute to tell you why we wanted to organize this webinar. So the big picture objective is really to improve humanitarian coordination between traditional humanitarian actors, but also between those organizations and actors such as the private sector. We do hope that you will walk away from this webinar with a clearer understanding of why and how the humanitarian system works as it does, and why does humanitarian coordination matter? It does matter because different actors are needed to support Ukrainian people in need. Coordination between these actors can significantly improve the scale and the overall quality of the response. And as we all know, businesses are part of the social fabric and often among the first responders after any given crisis, including in Ukraine. So we recognize that businesses have played and continue to play a very important role in supporting Ukrainians, both kind of inside and outside the borders of the country. So in this webinar series, we're hoping to provide you with more information on how your actions can align with and support the broader work of humanitarian organizations. I would say next slide, please, Nara, and Tatiana, the floor is yours.
Дякую, Тіна. Для тих, що доєднуються прямо зараз, Будь ласка, оберіть мову, якою вам зручно сприймати інформацію. Я буду говорити українською, і ви можете обрати український канал. Якщо вам зручно слухати інформацію англійською, це також можливо зробити в ваших настройках. Я представляю глобальний договір ООН в Україні. Це організація, яка об'єднує бізнеси та разом з ними прагне до просування цілей сталого розвитку. Наразі в Україні 111 компаній, які є учасниками нашої мережі, і дуже дякую всім, хто доєднався сьогодні. Я трошечки торкнуся тих проєктів, які зараз відбуваються в глобальному договорі ООН, і де залучення приватного сектору є дуже важливим, і я рада тому, що українські бізнеси навіть попри все, навіть попри війну, доєднуються до ініціатив глобального договору ООН, навіть зараз підтримують його роботу і разом із нами роблять класні гуманітарні проекти. Але я хочу більше присвятити увагу не нашим проєктам, а передати слово нашим колегам з інших агенцій ООН. Це саме те, ради чого ми анонсували цю подію, і це саме відповідь на ті запитання, які ми отримуємо від різних компаній з всієї України про те, що ж саме робить система ООН для координації зусиль з гуманітарних питань в Україні. Але розпочинаємо з того, що робимо саме ми і де ми є експертами. Наступний слайд, будь ласка. Напевно, як і всі українці, ми намагаємося бути корисними в інформаційному просторі. І через різноманітні глобальні івенти ми доносимо ту біль, яку зараз відчуває кожен українець. Ми доносимо ті потреби, які зараз стоять перед Україною. Наприклад, ще минулого тижня наші представники наших компаній виступали на саміті лідерів і представляли відповідь українського бізнесу на те, що відбувається в Україні, яким чином український бізнес залучається до вирішення потреб пересічних українців. Україну представляв генеральний директор компанії «Фармак» пан Костюк, і це була дуже плідна дискусія, де ми розповідали про українські питання. Ми дуже раді зазначити, що Віктор Іванчик, засновник компанії «Астарта», став переможцем цього року в глобальній компанії SDG Pioneers. Ми вперше брали участь на глобальному рівні в цьому проєкті, і тішить те, що попри все, що відбувається в Україні, українські компанії все ж таки замислюються над тим, що буде завтра і яким чином слід будувати свою діяльність в Україні сьогодні для того, щоб ми змогли відбудувати нашу країну. І вже як глобальний договір ООН за підтримки партнерів ми провели великий медіафорум для того, щоб поговорити, яким чином люди по всьому світу можуть сприймати інформацію про Україну, де є правдива інформація і де є фейкова інформація. Яким чином сприймають цю інформацію агенції, які оцінюють компанії за ESG, кому довіряти, де дійсно інформація, яка показує, що компанія працює за принципами, міжнародними стандартами системи ООН, а де ця інформація є фейковою. Ми запрошували різноманітних експертів зі всього світу і обговорювали ці питання для того, щоб зрозуміти, яким чином ми можемо впливати на доступ до саме правдивої інформації. І ми дійсно підіймали питання колективних дій з антикорупції, яким чином повинен діяти бізнес сьогодні для того, щоб завтра мати змогу отримувати фінансову підтримку від міжнародних донорів, які захочуть вкладатися у відновлення країни. Наступний слайд, будь ласка. Гуманітарна допомога – це також те, чим займається зараз вся Україна, і глобальний договір ООН не може стояти осторонь. Ми робимо те, що ми можемо робити найкраще. Ми поєднуємо. Ми поєднуємо компанії та організації зі всього світу з українським бізнесом та з тими, хто потребує нашої допомоги. До нас часто звертаються міжнародні донори, ті, хто хочуть допомогти і хочуть допомагати в чомусь конкретному, точковому. І таким чином ми розуміємо, хто з українських бізнесів робить що, на яких територіях, і хто може допомогти отримати цю допомогу і передати саме тим, хто її потребує прямо зараз. Наприклад, до нас звернулася одна з компаній з ім'ям Pullman, яка виробляє інноваційні системи очищення води. Наприклад, можна брати воду навіть з річки, очищувати її через ті системи, які встановлені, і отримувати вже питну воду. Ця система самопересувна, вона на такому трьохколісному механізмі встановлена, і завдяки сонячним батареям вона може пересуватися самостійно до 50 кілометрів. Ми поєднали цю компанію з Миколаївською адміністрацією, яка зараз найбільше, напевно, потребує чистої води через пошкодження водоводів. Ми знайшли компанію, яка може покрити фінансово-логістичні витрати на доставлення цих систем до Миколаєва. Це компанія ДТЕК. І через цю колаборацію ми змогли вже доставити першу систему очистки води, і зараз ми розробляємо проєкт по доставленню ще 9 таких систем. Ми сподіваємося, що ми зможемо допомогти людям отримувати доступ до чистої питної води. Також ми співпрацюємо з канадською організацією, яка зараз закінчує збирати гуманітарну допомогу для системи МЧС в Україні. І через колаборацію з різними компаніями ми працюємо над тим, щоб доставити цю допомогу до Варшави і після цього до України, до тих органів та організацій та підрозділів, які потребують цього обладнання. Це понад 10 тисяч тонн обладнання, яке вже прямує до України. Наступний слайд, будь ласка. Ми завжди робили дуже гарно і продовжуємо робити освітні проекти навіть зараз. Так, вже понад 2 роки у нас працює програма IT Nation, коли ми навчаємо людей IT-спеціальності з нуля. Протягом 6 місяців людина може отримувати знання від експертів і змінювати свою професію, ставати на шлях IT-спеціаліста. Буквально цього місяця ми розпочали донабір на перший курс з ручного тестування і отримали понад 1500 заявок тільки в донаборі. У нас вже навчаються на цій системі 1500 людей, і ще 1500 заходять в цю програму прямо зараз. Я думаю, що ця програма здатна допомогти тим українцям, які втратили роботу, які хочуть перекваліфікації, отримати таку перекваліфікацію і отримати можливість заробляти додаткові кошти на себе, на свою родину і розвивати себе як експерта в IT-сфері. І вже завтра, 15 червня, ми запускаємо набір на програму SEED, коли ми будемо допомагати людям отримати бізнес-знання з розроблення бізнес-плану, ведення бізнесу, для того, щоб люди, які є підприємцями в Україні, але ще не дійшли до створення свого бізнесу, змогли зрозуміти, якими принципами керуватися, яким чином розробити план. В кінці програми вони зможуть захистити свої плани та отримати мікрофінансування від нашого проєкту. Сподіваємося також отримати досить багато заявок від тих людей, які хочуть розвивати саме власний бізнес. Наступний, будь ласка. І гуманітарні проекти, які робить глобальний договір ООН. Це програма допомоги з відбудови ментального здоров'я. Ми зараз працюємо над розбудовою онлайн-платформи, на яку вже відібрано професійних психологів з України, які будуть надавати консультації, безкоштовні консультації для українців, які потребують допомоги психологів. Ми вже провели декілька тренінгів, відкритих тренінгів від психологів на широку аудиторію з різних питань, яким чином допомогти собі під час війни, яким чином розмовляти з дітьми під час війни, арт-терапія для дітей під час війни. І ми бачимо досить позитивний зворотній зв'язок від наших учасників, що вони цього потребують. Якщо ми подивимося на офіційні цифри керівників держави, які говорять про те, що принаймні 15 мільйонів українців потребуватимуть допомоги, психологічної допомоги, то розуміємо, що наш проєкт є вкрай важливим. Ми вже залучили 3 партнери до цього проєкту. Це і Укрсиббанк, це Schneider Electric Foundation і Foundation de France, які допомагають нам з розбудовою платформи, з підбором учасників, з підбором психологів, зі створенням ком'юніті для психологів і з оплатою роботи психологів в цьому проєкті. Я сподіваюся, що вже до кінця цього місяця ми зможемо запустити платформу, на якій люди зможуть самі обирати, з яким психологом вони хочуть працювати і яку саме підтримку вони очікують. І наш наступний проєкт – це проєкт «Надай роботу українцю». Ми розуміємо, що понад 5 мільйонів українців вже покинули Україну і, на жаль, не всі з них зможуть повернутися найближчим часом до України з різних причин, із безпекових, із тим, що вони втратили житло, із тим, що певні території є досить окупованими. Тому ми звернулися до мережі глобального договору ООН у всьому світі з проханням через свої компанії надавати робочі місця для українців, які перебувають в тій чи іншій країні, або українцям, які можуть працювати в онлайн. І разом з нашими українськими партнерами ми вже викладаємо цю інформацію на порталах Happy Monday та інших ресурсів, де можна знайти інформацію про такі вакансії. Ці вакансії щотижня поповнюються. Ми дуже раді, що наші партнери з всього світу відкликаються на наші запити і надають свої вакансії на ці платформи. Наступний слайд, будь ласка. І наші міжнародні проекти, які ми продовжуємо попри все, попри те, що в Україні йде війна, це проект «Разом проти корупції» Anti-Corruption Collective Action Initiative. Ми розпочали цей проект 2 роки тому і бачимо його потребу сьогодні навіть більше, ніж то було 2 роки тому. Тому ми об'єднуємо бізнеси, які можуть долучатися до цього проекту, приймати участь в робочих групах і думати над тим, яким чином можна впливати на подальшу розбудову і відбудову України. І наш новий проект Climate Ambition Accelerator, в який ми запросили українські бізнеси, які є учасниками глобального договору ООН, і ці компанії будуть визначати, яким чином визначити науково обґрунтовані цілі зменшення свого викиду парникових газів від роботи власного бізнесу, і яким чином можна звітувати про їхні досягнення. Стартує наш акселератор вже наступного тижня, 21 червня. До нас долучилися 12 компаній. Не дивлячись на те, що зараз бізнес в Україні знаходиться у скрутному становищі, бізнес розуміє, що питання клімату є дуже важливим, дуже актуальним, і бізнес дуже бажає працювати в цьому акселераторі і встановлювати свої власні цілі, навчатися це робити навіть зараз. Тому ми продовжуємо працювати в повну силу. Вся наша команда знаходиться, на жаль, в різних країнах світу. Більшість команди повернулися до України, але ми можемо працювати дистанційно в цих умовах, і ми будемо раді бачити нових партнерів, які будуть долучатися до наших різноманітних ініціатив. Дуже дякую за увагу і передаю слово своїм колегам з інших агенцій ООН.
Many thanks, Tatiana. It is impressive that even in these very difficult times, the Ukrainian Global Compact's local network has been able to operate and provide value to companies and, of course, support Ukrainians from mental health to employment and beyond. We definitely believe that with your connections, both to the UN side and the private sector, you can not only highlight the humanitarian needs, but also share good practices, inspire more action, and even facilitate partnerships between different stakeholders. This is important not only in responding to the most immediate needs, but exactly what you said, you know, the people are already kind of looking forward, and all of these elements will be critical also in building back and restoring the country. So thank you for highlighting the work that you're doing. Now, CBI and OCHA launched a business guide or business brief as an introduction to the humanitarian system last year, but that document is rather generic, and therefore it does not necessarily reflect the exact realities in every country. I would now like to invite James Wetherill from OCHA, the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, to provide us that overview and the specific structures in Ukraine. So James, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tina. And first I'd like to thank Tatiana and also the Ukraine, the Ukraine Global Compact Initiative for inviting us and for co-hosting this event. I think this is a great opportunity for us to reach out and to explain the humanitarian architecture, how the humanitarian system, the international humanitarian system works, and to be here to take questions and to try to make it understood what it is what we're trying to do here. First, as Tina said, my name is James Wetherill. I'm the Deputy Head of Office of the UN's Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, usually called OCHA for short. OCHA is a bit of a unique humanitarian agency within the UN. We don't provide humanitarian assistance in the way the World Food Programme provides food, or say the UN High Commissioner for Refugees provides shelter material or supports refugees outside the country. What we do at OCHA is we try to coordinate the overall global humanitarian response throughout the world. And so here in Ukraine, it's no different. We are here to ensure and to try to coordinate the essence of the response. So the idea is you've got many humanitarian different actors, and they all are trying to do the right thing to try to address the needs of the affected population. And many times there's a lot of duplication, there's a lot of unknown things that are going on, there's lots of people trying to scramble for resources, and it can get quite chaotic. And so what we try to do is bring coherence to it, to try to provide information about what's going on, and to ensure that all of the people who have been affected by a crisis are able to receive the assistance that they need. So in this presentation, I'd like to try to give an overview of what is the humanitarian architecture of the international system, what has been done up to this point, and how we work together with the local actors, with the government of Ukraine, and especially how we can best work with the private sector. So thank you for moving to the next slide. just to say that the overall humanitarian response in a country is, oh no, sorry, Sam, this one, I have to talk a little bit about the actors. The overall humanitarian response in a country is the responsibility of the country. When a crisis happens, the first people to respond are those people who are affected. I mean, if you are in your own neighborhood and something happens, you don't wait for something to come in. What you do is you try to help people right away. And this is what we have seen in Ukraine, what we see in every crisis in the world, is that the first people to respond are the local actors, the people that are affected themselves, the civil society organizations, the private sector organizations, the companies that are there. Everybody tries to lend a hand to help each other. The national government of every country, of course, has the responsibility to protect their population, to provide the services to their population. And in many cases, when there's a war or when there's a huge crisis, it overwhelms the capacity of the government, and they reach out to the international community, to the United Nations, and request support and assistance. And so this diagram on this page shows that the overall response is coordinated by the government. The request for assistance comes out, and then you have a myriad of different international response that comes in. On the UN side, you have the specialized agencies like the World Food Program and the others that I mentioned, the World Health Organization, providing specialized services to the population in coordination with the government. But you also have many other organizations, international non-governmental organizations, which are, you know, the CARES and the Save the Children's and the Oxfams of the world. And these come in and they support, mostly working with local organizations in the country that have the knowledge, that have the language skills, that know where the people are, to work with them to ensure that the assistance gets to where the people are. In all of these cases, both at the global level and in the country level, the private sector provides an incredibly important role. First and foremost, obviously, all of the assistance that is provided is procured through the private sector. And then in many cases, the private sector also is stepping in to provide facilitation and support and also assistance in kind in both and in cash. So it is important to understand that the system isn't just the United Nations. In fact, the United Nations makes up only a small part of the overall actors that provide the response. You have other intergovernmental organizations such as the International Committee for the Red Cross and also the International Federation of the Red Cross, which support the national societies. And you have the international banking system as well, which helps to support the overall financing of the recovery and the rebuilding of the country when the crisis is done. So the one thing that we want to make sure in all of these cases is that we're not losing sight of the people themselves who are affected by the crisis. It's all very well to come in and provide assistance. You see people that are hungry, you want to give them food. But the reality is the people that are affected by the crisis, they know best about what it is that they want. And so we need to make sure that they remain at the center of our thinking and that we're always consulting with and speaking to the affected people, which is why it's so important that we have regular assessments and interaction with the population to know what it is that they need, and we're providing the assistance that they actually need. One thing that we want to also make sure is that we don't take advantage of the population, and this is in many cases we've heard globally in different crises where you've had certain abuses that have been carried out against the affected population, whether it be sexual abuse or other ways of taking advantage of the population. We need to make sure that the people that we're trying to assist are not adversely affected by the response that's taking place. Because as we know, we have lots of different actors that show up, and I think many people in the early stages of the crisis were very concerned, for example, in the issue of human trafficking as the refugees were fleeing across the border. The same thing is also very problematic or troubling when you think about the issue of protecting people from sexual exploitation and abuse. And I understand there's going to be a session next week that's going to address some of these issues, which is, I'm glad that there's going to be a whole dedicated session because it is extremely important that we're focusing on the needs of the population. Next slide, please. So just to say a little bit about how the overall planning for the response takes place. So at a global level, we have what we call the humanitarian program cycle, and this is what we apply in pretty much all the crises that we respond to globally. And it's a very straightforward system cycle that feeds itself. And it's, as you would expect, you go in and you analyze what the needs are. You do an assessment of what is needed, and you take a time to do some planning for your response. Once you've figured out what your plan is, you need to mobilize the resources, because of course all of these responses require money. And then once you have the resources, then you start to implement. And as you're implementing and providing assistance to the population, you're monitoring what you're doing, taking into account things that are maybe going right, things that are going wrong, you adjust it. And then eventually you do an evaluation. And based upon the feedback that you get, when you go into the planning process again for the next time you're doing to deliver assistance, hopefully you have fixed some of the problems that you were having, engaging more with the population, the affected population, about what their needs are, so that all the time we're continually improving the response. And so I think it's very necessary to emphasize that there's a lot of planning that goes in, a lot of evaluation, a lot of monitoring, so that we can ensure that we are actually getting what it is needed to the population that needs the assistance. In the context of Ukraine, the product of, once the war began in February, we issued a flash appeal very quickly after the beginning of the war. I think it was on the 1st of March. And the flash appeal was based upon a lot of thinking and contingency planning that was taking place in the months prior. And so while we did not have a lot of good information, obviously it was a bit chaotic in the first weeks or month of the war to know exactly what the needs were, but there were several assumptions that were made. And so we made a flash appeal, and a flash appeal is something that we issue in the beginning of a crisis. It's usually based upon a lot of assumptions about the needs, and then therefore, because it's assuming a lot, we make it for a short period, about 3 months. And so we issued a flash appeal in the beginning of March to cover the period of March, April, and May, and with key objectives, primarily first and foremost to provide life-saving humanitarian assistance to the population that was affected, and secondarily to ensure that the population was protected and the civilian infrastructure was protected, and that as humanitarians, I mean, obviously we can't go out and protect in the way like the military will protect, but mostly in terms of advocacy and ensuring that the population has the information that they need in order to be able to get to where they need to go, and facilitating the movement of people to get them into safety. All of this is done ensuring that that again, we're protecting the interests of the population and having gender sensitive programming that is differentiating the needs of what the women and the elderly and the children might require, because of course the needs of different types of people are indeed quite different. We, in accordance with this cycle, we did, after about 6 weeks, 7 weeks, we did issue a revision to the flash appeal to extend it for 6 months, refining a bit the focus of what we're trying to do, and also making sure that we are, again, taking into account the information that we're able to get through our assessment, and also to be able to ensure that we are mobilizing the resources looking forward in order to be able to provide the response. Now, the resources that we're mobilizing are primarily coming from member states and governments, but in the case of Ukraine, there has been an overwhelming response from the private sector globally, and also providing cash assistance to many of the agencies that are providing the response. Now, in all of these cases, this flash appeal is not standing alone for the international community. It's always in support of the efforts that the government is trying to coordinate. And the government itself remains first and foremost in the front, and we are there to support the efforts that they are making, both at the national level, at the oblast level, and that's at the municipal and Hromada level across the country. Now, in these cases, it's important that the private sector is engaged. Obviously, the private sector is already working and already providing a lot of assistance to the population. And the more that it's engaged with the coordination that's going on, the better it can plug into where are the gaps and what are the needs. And so that we also, as the international humanitarian community, can fill in the places where either the private sector or local actors are not able to respond, and vice versa. Next slide, please. Okay, so just to give you an overview of some of the overall planning figures. So what we have on the slide here is we've got the total population of Ukraine, estimated. Of course, there hasn't been a census in quite some years, so you see ranges of 40 to 44 or so million. And overall, in the April revision of the flash appeal, we estimated that there were about 24 million people in need. This is including 15.7 million people in need that were inside Ukraine, and up to 8.3 million people in need who have fled the country. And so this figure of 8.3 million is a projection, and it was based upon seeing the flow of the population leaving the country as refugees. And while right now we are at about 4.8 million refugees in neighboring countries, the projection was through the end of the year, potentially up to 8.3 million displaced people could be in need. So overall, all about 24 million people, which is well over half the population of Ukraine, being in need of assistance. Now, the humanitarian response, international humanitarian response, cannot address every single need. The funding required to do so is overwhelming, and the capacity to do so is considerable that's required. And so the actual planning for the response was targeting 8.7 million people inside the country and 8.3 million people outside the country, for a total of 17 million people. So the impact of the war in Ukraine, in addition, as I'm sure you are all very well aware, it's not just on the people in Ukraine or from Ukraine. Given the incredible role that Ukraine plays in the global food production and in production of fertilizer, the impact on the agricultural sector globally has been massive. And what we're seeing now is global food prices are skyrocketing across the world, and we're actually having cases where access to food in many countries in low income or in fragile states, especially in Africa, are already seeing huge price rises and a much decreased availability of food resources. So I know that there's a number of initiatives looking at ways to enable the wheat reserves to be able to leave the country. Of course, this requires the opening of the ports and to ensure that access. There is just not a capacity to be able to move that quantity of wheat that exists by rail or by truck. Even obviously that is happening, but the requirements are far beyond what can be done by the ground transportation alone. So unless we are able to open it up, we do expect to see a huge impact or continued impact on the global markets, and unfortunately, with millions more people falling into severe food insecurity globally. So next slide, please. So again, in the world of the coordination that we do, we need to make sure that everybody has a common understanding of the situation and the crisis. And so obviously you as local actors, as Ukrainians, you are much better placed to understand what's going on than we as the international community. But we need to make sure that our partners, all the international NGOs, all of the UN agencies, all have a common understanding of where the needs are, where the crisis is really impacting the population directly, and in what kind of ways. And so we put out information products on a regular basis. One example here is this map that you see on this page, showing areas that are under occupation, where the different dots that you see on the page, the red and orange, are showing the impact of the conflict, or where hostilities are taking place. This is the snapshot over time. And also where are the displaced population. So the numbers that are in the blue bubbles are showing the numbers of people who have been displaced and where they're displaced to, and the number of people in need. The dots that are shown, again, are only on those that have some kind of humanitarian impact. So it's not just showing simply missile strikes, artillery strikes, but where locations where you've had an impact on the civilian population, on civilian infrastructure, some kind of humanitarian impact. So where we are today, the numbers have continued to go up and down, and certainly with the civilian casualties, those that we are showing here on the page are those that have been confirmed and verified. We are very aware that the actual numbers are much higher. It does take some time in order to be able to gain access to verify the actual numbers of people who have been killed or injured, but these are the numbers at very least that have been verified. And up to date, we have seen that half of the casualties have all been taking place in the Oblast of Donetsk and Luhansk in eastern Ukraine. The number of people displaced is about 7.1 million. The number is down from what it was just a few weeks ago. And this shows the number of people who are continuing to return home. There's a number of different surveys that are taking place on a regular basis to estimate the location and the numbers of the displaced, and also the intentions of the population movements. The same thing is said for the number of refugees. I think the numbers were as high as 7 million in terms of the people who have crossed the border, but the actual number of refugees is now estimated at about 4.8 million, because there's been quite a number of people who have crossed back and forth across the border. And so you can't just use border crossings as a number, because people have returned. Some people have come back just to retrieve family members, or to check on their home, and have then returned. And so the number of returns is also very difficult to estimate the actual number of people who have returned, just because of the continued movement of the population. Now, all of this information feeds into our planning, and in terms of where we should be working, where we should be targeting, and the nature of the assistance that we should be providing. Next slide, please. So the overall presence in terms of who is actually providing the assistance when we're talking about the international organizations, the national organizations, and the like. We currently have about 315 different organizations or bodies that are engaged in the international humanitarian coordination architecture. And when I say that, these are the ones that are actually working together that we know of. There are clearly many, many more organizations than this, but these are the ones that are regularly engaged with the different actors on providing the assistance. What this map is showing is the location of where these actors are. The larger number are those that are in the darker oblasts, so the majority are in the east. Of course, with Lviv being close to the border with Poland and the main entry point into the country, we see many, many actors set themselves up in Lviv first, and then move to other parts of the country where the needs are. So you have quite a large number there. The same thing can be said for Chernovici, where you also have people coming in from Romania, setting up an office there, and then going further out into the country. The vast majority, though, are moving towards Dnipro, working in Kharkiv and Donetsk, and previously, of course, in Luhansk as well. But right now, it's much more difficult to gain access into that area, as you are all very well aware. And on the right side of the page, you have the bubbles showing the numbers and types of the different actors. So the vast majority of the organizations we work with are national NGOs. They're the civil society organizations that are operating across Ukraine. And they represent, with the international NGOs, which is the second largest bubble, they represent the largest number. Over 2/3 of all of the actors are NGOs. And then you have the UN organizations, the main ones like UNICEF and IOM and the Refugee Agency and the World Food Program, the World Health Organization, and the like. But you'll see also in this list, we're also including a number of government partners, so governmental organizations. And then the other includes organizations like the Red Cross, bilateral donors, and others who are engaged in this kind of assistance. Just to note that to compare where we were pre-February, because of course the humanitarian system has been working in Ukraine since 2014 with the conflict in Donetsk and Luhansk in the east. The number of actors has expanded dramatically. We were engaged with and working with approximately 120 different organizations up until through February, and so you can see the number has almost tripled in the last 3 months, as many more organizations have entered the country, but mostly as organizations that are operational across the country where we were not previously working. National and local organizations have now become engaged into the humanitarian assistance. Next slide, please. So when people like me talk about humanitarian architecture, I mean, it's rather a lot of UN jargon. What the humanitarian architecture really means is, how do we ensure that we're actually coordinating? And in all humanitarian crises, the UN appoints what we call the humanitarian coordinator. And usually this is the most senior UN official in country who has a responsibility for ensuring that the humanitarian response is coherent. OCHA, again, as I mentioned before, we are responsible for coordinating the overall humanitarian response. So we support this person in their work. In Ukraine, it is Osnat Lubrani, who has been here for just about 4 years, working on humanitarian coordination. And she also at the same time has a responsibility for working on the development side, and that's called the resident coordinator. So the overall humanitarian coordinator is supported by OCHA in her work, but she's also supported by what's called a humanitarian country team. Now, the humanitarian country team is a body that's made up of the heads of the largest humanitarian organizations operating in country, representing both the United Nations and NGOs. And now the NGOs, it's including both national NGOs and international NGOs. And together, this body should represent well over half of the humanitarian assistance that's being provided by the international system because of the size and the scope of their humanitarian programs. And so the humanitarian country team is a strategic and decision-making body that endorses decisions on how we're going to work, what are the objectives of the work. They're the ones who will produce the actual planning documents or endorse the planning documents about what the requirements are for the humanitarian response, how much money, how many people are targeted, all those figures that we had from that I showed in the previous slides, what's required under a flash appeal. These are all things that this strategic body determines about the way forward. The humanitarian country team meets on a regular basis. Right now, it's on a weekly basis to review issues of concern, and in order to be able to highlight issues and many times raise concerns or recommendations with the government. And I'll get to a bit about how do we relate to the government in future slides. Now, in addition to the humanitarian country team, obviously coordination is not simply having heads of agencies come together. We need to make sure that our technical assistance that we're providing is well coordinated and well planned and well thought out. So that assistance packages are similar across the country. When we're providing food assistance, it's the same kind of food assistance that's being given across. So we don't create problems with people feeling that some people in one area are getting more assistance and then in other areas, that the nature of health activities is similar across the country. So we have standards for the humanitarian response. Now, these are basically technical sectors. In the jargon of the humanitarian system, we call them clusters, but basically these are technical and thematic coordination bodies where we bring together all those actors that work on a thematic area. So for example, under the health sector, the health cluster, all organizations that are providing health assistance in the country, international organizations and local, come together to discuss what the needs are and to ensure that they are coordinated about who's working where, what they're doing, and the type of work that's being done, and the kind of support that's being provided, and ensure that they're prioritizing, that certain populations in need over other populations in need. They develop the standards, and then this feeds into the planning of the overall response. The government is involved in all of this coordination. We have oblast level government. We have these coordination done at the local level, and at the national level, we have ministerial participation in these different bodies. The main ones are related to the coordination of food, the coordination of health, and the coordination of shelter, and then also protection, which is about the legal protections that are required, especially for people that don't have documentation or have been displaced and that kind of thing. And water and sanitation services. There are other more technical sectors related to logistics and ensuring that we have the telecommunications and that the transit centers for IDPs are being managed correctly and those kind of things. But overall, the main thrust of the assistance is towards the big sectors related to food, water, and health, as you would imagine. Now, in order to ensure that the work of the different clusters or these sectors is coordinated amongst themselves, because of course, there's nobody that has just one need. You don't just need food, you need water, you need food, you need health, you need a myriad of different assistance. We bring them together, the leaders of each of these sectoral coordination groups, we also bring them together to discuss what the needs are so that we ensure that the package of assistance that people are receiving is balanced and it's not just a single sector. This is called the intersector coordination group or the intercluster coordination group. Next slide, please. So where's the government fit in all of this? as I mentioned, in the sectoral coordination, the government is engaged at different levels in each of these sectoral meetings. And so sometimes it's very clear, like the Ministry of Health is involved in the health coordination. But when you're talking about things like the shelter or the water programming, it may be different ministries because you don't have necessarily a ministry of water, doesn't exist, or a ministry of shelter. So you have things like Ministry of Regional Affairs, Ministry of Social Policy, and other parts of the government that will be engaged in the coordination with the international coordination on this. So at the highest level, in Ukraine, we have two senior officials. I mentioned the humanitarian coordinator already. In the context of the current crisis in Ukraine, we also have what's known as the crisis coordinator, a gentleman named Amin Awad. He was appointed by the Secretary General in early March of this year to come out and provide overall guidance and coordination with the government of Ukraine and provide strategic guidance also for the overall humanitarian response. Both the humanitarian coordinator and the crisis coordinator are regularly engaging on a daily basis with different ministers, different people from the cabinet of ministers, from the president's office, to ensure that the communication is open and about what the needs are and where we should be working. I think in the early days of the crisis, there was a lot of criticism against the UN for not responding or not providing assistance. I think it's well justified. The UN is a slow machine. The international response is slow to react. Obviously, the money needs to come in, the people need to be deployed. And it did take some time for us to scale up, but I think at this stage, it's a bit stronger, a bit better now. But the coordination and the communication has always been very strong and very good relationship. The government, or I should say President Zelensky, made a decree early on in order to set up a coordination structure amongst the government and ministries to ensure that there was a proper and good humanitarian coordination structure, providing that for not only the role of the presidency or the president's office, but also for certain ministers, including the Vice Prime Minister for European integration, who has taken a leading role on humanitarian assistance, and also the Vice Prime Minister for the Ministry of Reintegration of the Temporarily Occupied Territories, who has also been working on a different aspect of it. Now, there are other ministries like the Ministry of Social Policy, which is also heavily engaged, but in terms of the roles, we regularly are speaking with and talking to not just at the ministerial level with our crisis coordinator, humanitarian coordinator, but also within the ministries at the much more operational level on a regular basis, if not daily basis, to ensure that we have common understanding and we can also address and resolve problems as they arise. But most importantly, we have coordination at the oblast level and also at the municipal level, and indeed also at the Hromada level at the smaller communities. This is dealing with much more the individual needs that are taking place within an oblast. We have, at the international community, we've set up humanitarian operational hubs in several different places in the country to cover the regions. So, for example, we're covering much of the east in the areas that are still controlled by the government out of Dnipro. We do continue to maintain presence in Donetsk and Luhansk from before the current war, although our ability to operate on the other side in the Russian-controlled territory is very limited by our access constraints. We also have established offices in Kiev. Obviously, we had those pre-war, but also in Odessa, in Vinnytsia, and also here in Lviv, and then some smaller offices to deal with IDP population in Uzhhorod and also Chernovitsi. From each of these operational hubs, we have been engaging not only with the governors of the oblasts where they're located, but also reaching out to the nearby oblasts to ensure that we are having regular coordination and regular communication with the not just the governor's office at the governor and deputy governor level and different heads of departments, but also at the municipal level, especially in the larger cities, whether it be Dnipro or Lviv or Kharkiv. But also some of the smaller ones, because the needs of these locations are quite particular. Of course, the establishment of this coordination has been taking a bit of time. I think it's much better now than it was before, because it requires a lot of personnel, a lot of staff to be in these locations. And so the better our relationship, the more we are able to engage, the better information we have about the needs, and the better we are able to respond. Next slide, please. So just to say a little bit about where we are in our current humanitarian response. To date, overall, there are about 8.1 million people inside Ukraine who have received some kind of humanitarian assistance. The vast majority of these, you can see in the bar chart on the left side, it's people who have received assistance in some kind of food assistance. Now, of the 6.7 million people who have received food assistance, it runs the range. Some of them are maybe as simple as receiving bread from bakeries that have been supported and set up in the Kharkiv area and other areas by the World Food Program, and others who have received a full multi-month ration of staple food items like flour and oil, or ready to eat foods that have been distributed. The next sector that's received has reached the largest number of people is the WASH sector, and the WASH means the water, sanitation, and hygiene. So delivery of water, delivery of hygiene supplies, and assistance, and that's over to 3.3 million people. And then the health response. The health response has been quite considerable, and it's mostly done directly with the Ministry of Health, engaging directly with the existing hospitals and clinics across the country. To date, about 2.7 million people are estimated to have been assisted. Notably, I think it's around 290 metric tons of medical supplies have been delivered. Of course, when you're thinking about tablets and different types of medical supplies, you don't really think about it in metric tons, but the reality is it's a huge quantity of supplies that have been distributed across the country, and that has been done in very, very close coordination with the government. The assistance has been across the country in all oblasts, in all locations, and the progress has been noticeable over time. I mean, since you can see from the chart, since the end of April, so the last 6 weeks or so, we've gone from 4 million people that have been assisted to double that to 8 million. Now, what we need to make clear on this is the 8 million people that have assisted overall doesn't mean that all of their needs have been covered. It just means that they've received some kind of assistance. And so they're very well, as you know, from your own experience and from what you've seen, there still remains a huge amount of need out there and a lot of assistance that remains to be provided. So in addition to the medical supplies, just to give a couple numbers, I think it's around 17,000 metric tons of food have been delivered, and some 444,000 kits, including things like mattresses and blankets and clothing and cookingware and the like, have also been distributed to ensure that the displaced people can receive the assistance they need. Now, just to give a sense of the kinds of different priorities, in the east of the country, some of the priority assistance has been to try to get things across the line, across the front line of the conflict to those areas that are now controlled by the Russian Federation, to provide assistance to the areas that are out of government of Ukraine control. Frankly, this has been very unsuccessful. It's been almost impossible to negotiate access with the Russian Federation, and very little assistance has been able to, or almost no assistance has been able to cross the line. Now, through some local NGO partners on the ground inside Donetsk, we have been able to provide some assistance into areas that, for example, including in Mariupol and in Donetsk and Volnovakha, places that are obviously inaccessible from this side. But the actual access constraints have been so severe that it's been very difficult to get there. The next priority area is those areas that are along the conflict line. Working right now to ensure that we're getting assistance into places like Bakhmut, so that they have supplies. If the city should fall in the coming weeks, they will have assistance already in place to be able to provide the assistance to the population. And then finally, of course, we are providing assistance to IDPs in the west of the country, or center in the west of the country, basic assistance. Next slide, please. The kind of assistance we are providing to these, it's primarily in the area of multi-purpose cash. Multi-purpose cash, basically, it's giving people cash. It's a cash that's not been, we don't tell them how they're supposed to do it. People, the most responsive and most flexible modality of assistance that you can provide a population is just giving them money so they can decide what to do with it. you're not telling them they have to take this and take this blanket or take this bucket, but indeed giving them the cash that they need to be able to respond. The cash program has scaled rapidly. Some $200 million or more than $200 million has already been dispersed since the end of March. And we have a target of distributing about $600 million of cash by the end of August to some 2 million people. Now, where it says 1.69 million people that have been reached, many of those have only received 1 month of worth of cash, and therefore the dollar value will increase as it gets closer to 2 million and the full amount of assistance. Now, each of these people are receiving an allocation of, it's equivalent to 2,220 hryvnia per month for 3 months. And before the inflation, this was around $75. So it's probably more like $67 at this point per person per month. So a family of 4 for 3 months would receive about $900. And this would be to support whatever kind of things they would like to spend it on, whether it's clothing or food. Majority of it would be for food. Next slide, please. So in terms of the overall funding requirements and funding received, to date, the funding appeal of $2.25 billion has received over 70% of funding, which is quite well funded. $1.6 billion has been received. And the table actually shows a lot of the sectors receiving not so much money, but the reality is the information about funding that we receive, it's provided by the donors about how much money they provide to different organizations. We don't always know what they're spending it on. Now we'll get after my presentation, Karim will give a presentation on some of the private sector funding that's coming through as well. Usually the problem really is knowing exactly what the money is being spent on. So while some of these sectors look like they're underfunded, the reality is over half of the funding has not yet been stated about which area it's being spent on. And so therefore we don't quite have a sense for which sectors are more underfunded. Next slide, please. Now, in Ukraine, we have a fund where donors can provide money to the fund. It's called the Ukraine Humanitarian Fund. And this fund is managed by the humanitarian coordinator, and the humanitarian coordinator is able to allocate money out to activities and projects where they're needed. This is very helpful to donors in general, because many donors, government donors, don't know where to provide the money to, and don't have the information about who the partners are on the ground. And so we as the international humanitarian system have a sense for this and can provide funding to different actors in different locations, primarily focusing on the national partners. To date, the fund this year has received over $200 million. It's $208 million, which makes it the largest fund currently in the world. And it just shows the level of interest from donors. And we have allocated 91 million of that. Now, the reason why not more of it has been allocated is that much of the funding that's been contributed has arrived in the last month or so. And so we're getting prepared for yet another allocation to take place. This funding enables us to reach the most hard to reach areas and to ensure that we get it to local actors that are closest to the people in need. Next slide, please. And just quickly, the funding has been provided to some 38 partners, the vast majority of whom are NGOs. Like 3/4 of them are NGOs. About 1/4 are to national NGOs in terms of the funding, and then half to international NGOs. The difference in the funding levels really has to do with the capacity. Many of the international NGOs have much more capacity to handle large funds. The actual number of projects going to national NGOs is about equal to the number of projects going to international NGOs. It's just that their capacity for handling large amounts of money is not as high. Next slide, please. So finally, just to say that we have a lot of information about the humanitarian needs, the planning documents, what's being done, the progress to date. This is available on a website called humanitarianresponse.info. And I encourage you to take a look at it. It's where you can find contacts of how the system works, contacts for who to meet with and who to coordinate with, response planning documents, maps, and the like. We have this kind of information for all crises in the world, not just for Ukraine. But if you go to this website, you can click on the Ukraine link and be able to see many of these kinds of reports that are available there. And then last slide, please. Next slide, please. Can you go to the next slide? Or have I frozen? No? All right, well, waiting to go to the next slide, just to say that the international humanitarian response works with and requires very close coordination with the private sector. The private sector plays an integral part of the overall response, as you see on this slide. I mean, just showing this Venn diagram of the UN, the NGOs, and the government. Private sector is equally there in part. We couldn't deliver assistance without the private sector trucks that are being provided. We couldn't deliver assistance without the facilitation that's required with the with getting things across the border and importing it, and the procurement of all kinds of different assistance that we do. And so we'd like to ensure that you have as much information as possible in order to be able to engage with and understand the system. And so the next section is going to be done a presentation on the Ukrainian private sector tracker, so you can understand better what assistance has been provided to date. But I would like to just to say that thank you for this opportunity to speak to you about how the humanitarian system works and the international humanitarian system, and to say that we're here to support the actual humanitarian response. We're not here to replace it. We're here to work together with the government, with the local NGOs, and most importantly, with you as a private sector to ensure that we're able to deliver the assistance to the population in need. So thank you very much. Thanks for the time, and sorry for me taking so much. Over to you. Thanks.
Many thanks, James. Our audience is familiar for sure with the situation, but it might sometimes be very difficult to understand how the UN or the humanitarian system works. So it was really helpful to get this overview from you. And what we don't necessarily find in mainstream media or anywhere really is the process. Like you highlighted, it starts with a request coming from the government for international assistance. And there are all these different pieces of the system that need to fit together and complement each other. So I think that was a very helpful overview, and I hope the audience learned new things as well. Colleagues, we have one short presentation before we go for the discussion and Q&A. I would like to remind you to post your questions in the Q&A box, and we will do our best to respond to those during this webinar. But now I'd like to give the floor to my colleague Karim El-Bayar, who has been leading the efforts to develop the Ukraine Private Sector Donations Tracker that James also referred to. So without further ado, Karim, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tina. Thank you, James, Tatiana, and thank you, dear colleagues. I see more than 40 companies represented here today on the call. It's really wonderful to have this, and we are well aware of the incredible contributions you've already made. I do want to emphasize, I'm going to give a very short presentation. If you have questions or comments for James, for Tatiana, or for me, please use the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. It's a great opportunity to speak with James, especially who's usually quite overwhelmed with work. So I know we've had some questions from a number of companies about the real practicalities about how to get involved and how to support the UN system. And I do encourage you to ask away. This is a safe place for you to ask any kind of question you'd like to ask. This isn't a session that is oriented for businesses. Next slide, please, Nara. I think there may be a slight delay with our slides, so hopefully the next slide will come up shortly. Okay, I see. The Wi-Fi has gone out. Well, let me take one quick second to bring up this slide. One moment, please. I can bring it up from my side. We have a note from our co-host that she's reconnecting. While she's reconnecting, I'll just say a few words about this. We've built a private sector contributions tracker, and this was at the request really of a number of stakeholders, including the Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and many other donors, international donors around the world. And as you've seen from the presentation before, we have a mechanism in place to understand the flow of contributions from governments and other major donors, but we haven't traditionally had a mechanism to track the contributions from businesses. So we built the Ukraine Private Sector Donations Tracker, which we'll show you in just a moment. It is a website, it's live, so you can go to it yourselves, but we will bring up a preview just in a moment here. In order to shine a light on the contributions of businesses around the world, we have tracked at least $1.5 billion of cash and in-kind contributions so far. We think the real number is probably greater than 2 billion, and we're continuing to work with companies and humanitarian organizations to really bring in the information about that flow. So here is a preview of the website, and it's a frozen preview, but the website itself is interactive. We wanted to make sure you could see it well. If you like, you can go to the web address that's at the bottom of your screen, bit.ly/biz4Ukraine tracker, and take a look at it yourself. But really, it's an interactive dashboard. When you load it, you'll see this first page that shows you on the left-hand side the total amount that we've been able to confirm as paid, and on the right-hand side, the amount that's been pledged, promised to be paid, or is in the process of being paid. Very often, it's already been done, but the reporting has to come back to us from the humanitarian organizations to move it over. But you see it's already over $1.4 billion. Can we go to the next slide, please, Nara? At the bottom of the first page, you'll see what we call a Sankey diagram. It's a flows diagram that shows money going from a given company to a given recipient. And if you move your mouse over a specific flow, you'll get information about that flow. So for example, here we've moved the mouse over a flow from a pharmaceutical company called MSD, which contributed more than $65 million worth of medicines, as well as cash to the humanitarian system. Can we go to the next slide, please? In addition to this overall view, you can also use the tracker website. At the top of the screen, there's a drop-down menu, and you can zoom in on any one company. So here we've selected the company Bayer, which is a German pharmaceutical company, and you can see the various flows of contributions. They've given both cash and in-kind support. Here you have a 900,000 euros worth of medicine that was donated to the Ministry of Health of Ukraine. You can also, on the interactive site, not here on this slide, you can move your mouse over the other contributions to learn more about what those are, how much money was given to the Ukrainian Red Cross Society, how much to the Polish Red Cross, what goods were delivered to the Ministry of Agrarian Policy and Food. So can we go to the next slide, please, Nara? In addition to this, we have as well a view by recipient. So here you're seeing the recipient, which is the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, IFRC, and you can see the contributions that have come in from businesses to IFRC. And again, moving your mouse over, you'll get the exact number. In this case, we have moused over a company that is an investment group that came out of IKEA, Interogo Holding, and they gave more than 5 million Swiss francs to IFRC. It shows up here as the dollar value as well. Next slide, please. So I want to close in just saying that what we have so far is, as I said, over 1.5 billion now, and we think it's probably closer to 2 billion. But I'll be honest in saying that we haven't received very many reports from Ukrainian companies. And I know that every company on this call just about has donated substantial amounts of money, time, goods, services. I very much would like to make sure that we capture that contribution as well. And again, this is something that is relied upon and used by the humanitarian community, by donors, by the Ukrainian government and other governments. We want to shine a light on the contributions that you are making. We also do want to promote accountability and transparency about those contributions and to show where money and goods and services are flowing from and where they are going to. So please do get in touch with our team. If you're interested, we'd love to have your company here. We are making a big push with the media and other organizations to highlight what other companies around the world are doing and what your companies are doing. Later today, in fact, we're going to have a Twitter conversation with the heads of social responsibility and giving at Bayer, the German pharmaceutical company, and Coin & Nagel, which is a huge Swiss shipping and logistics company, both of whom have given many millions of dollars for the benefit of Ukraine. We're going to have a very brief conversation with them today about why their companies are giving and how they're giving. And we'd like to do something similar with all of you. So By all means, if there is a report you'd like to make from your company, let us know. If you have any questions about this thing, please reach out to us. It's meant to be a tool. And now we have just a few minutes left, and I really do encourage you to please raise your hand if you can do that in the Zoom system. And if you can't, please use the Q&A if you have any questions, comments for any of the presenters you've heard so far. It's really a pleasure, and I'll turn it back over to Tina. Over to you, Tina.
Many thanks, Kareem, for the overview, but also that very clear call to action for our audience, asking them to reach out to us so we can also reflect their support in the tracker. Checking the Q&A box and encouraging you to submit more questions. There is one question that I'm just going to read out. It is coming from an NGO with consultative status by the UN, working with foldable housing shelters to use as mobile hospitals, among other uses in the war zone. They are already donating units in the affected zones to help people. So the question is, what is the possibility of getting some financial support to donate more units? So maybe this one, I would like to give the floor to James, if you could take this question.
Thanks. No, sure, absolutely. I think the first place to start, and when we're talking about the coordination that's happening with the sectors, is to be part of and coordinating with the health cluster. On the humanitarianresponse.info website, there is a information or whatever, a contact list for all the different clusters, and there's also a schedule for all the different meetings of the different clusters. And so when they meet, also the contact of the cluster coordinator, the head of the cluster, they would have all the information about who is working on what kind of assistance. And for the UN side, whether it's WHO or others, they're primarily they provide funding to local organizations, or they provide procurement of items. And so I think that would be the place to start in terms of getting information about who's working on these kind of things and who's able to provide it. But certainly this is a very clearly a health sector issue. And so I would encourage the organization to contact the health cluster. Head of the health cluster's name is Emanuele Brune. And if you go to the website, you'll be able to find the contact information, phone numbers and email addresses, and also the timing of the meetings that they have on a regular basis.
Thanks, James. And our colleague Karen just posted also in the chat the link to humanitarianresponse.info, where you can find the cluster or sector list and the leads. So for those of you who are interested, please do check that as well. There are no questions currently in the Q&A box, but there's still time. So please, colleagues, feel free to submit any questions. While we wait, maybe Tatiana, I wanted to make sure that I had also understood correctly. If I understood correctly, you would still welcome more companies to join your ongoing projects. If someone is interested, but they don't quite know how to get started, they would like to get more information, should they reach out to you, or what is the best way to learn more? And also, who would be the best person to ask more for more information about the Global Compact Network? If possible, could you even drop contact details in the chat box?
Дякую, Тіно. Так, зараз я скину наш сайт globalcompact.org.ua, на якому розташована вся інформація про наші проекти, які зараз відбуваються, з контактними даними менеджерів, які відповідають за той чи інший проект. Наші контакти відкриті. Якщо хтось потребує зв'язку, то запрошуємо вас долучатися, ставити питання і працювати разом.
Many thanks, Tatiana. I'm just checking also because you can raise your hand. I think one attendee has raised his hand, so we can unmute you and you can ask your question, or comment, share your experiences. Alexander, can you hear us? You should be able to unmute yourself. Alexander, I'm sorry, I will most likely pronounce your last name very incorrectly, but Alexander Ruchitsky, can you hear us? Oh,
Hello.
Yes, we
Yeah.
can hear you now. Thank you.
First of all, I want to thank you for a very good webinar. It was very informative, and it was very nice to meet all of you. And I want to thank from all Ukrainian people for all the efforts and everything you do for our country. Thank you a lot. And secondly, I want to say that I occasionally raised the hand. I didn't have questions. Actually, it did my kids when I just gave a phone for them. So I'm sorry for that.
That is perfectly fine, no worries. And we do welcome all of you also if you would like to raise your hand to ask a question or make a comment or share your experiences potentially working with the UN and the humanitarian system. That is most certainly also allowed. While we wait, I wanted to actually ask James, because I think this is also it's a great opportunity, a fairly unique opportunity to have such a large group of companies listening to you here at one go. So if you were to kind of do or ask the private sector for one thing, what would be your call to action to the Ukrainian private sector?
That's a bit of a tricky question, and the private sector is so diverse and covers so many different things. It's not one thing, as you all know. You cover the entire world as the private sector, but I think it's getting engaged on the overall response, getting yourself educated on how we work, because we really rely on you and everything that we do, whether it's buying fuel to ensure that we have fuel for the trucks that we're able to deliver, or our partners, which are our private companies that deliver the assistance, also have access to the fuel, so that we're really well coordinated and working together. And don't hesitate to reach out if there's any questions. I mean, again, I imagine, the UN is a big bureaucracy, and sometimes it's opaque, and there's not a clear point of entry. It's not to hesitate to reach out to see how we can collaborate better. We obviously, private sector has interests themselves of the business working just to make a profit, to ensure that they're able to continue employing people, but at the same time, on the social responsibility side, to provide contributions and donations. It doesn't have to be one or the other. It can be both together. The assistance that we provide, I mean, the UN certainly procures everything. It's not simply that we are asking for you to provide support, but also just to work together so that we can to ensure that the assistance that we want to procure, whether it's medical supplies or food assistance or hygiene supplies, that we have the assistance that's available in the locations that we need it when we need it. And so I think it's just to ask you to reach out and not to hesitate. We're happy to meet with anybody at any time. I'm certainly open to it, and I'm happy to have my contacts shared, and we can put you in touch with the different organizations that provide the different types of assistance to ensure that we're well connected together.
Thanks, James. There is a question also in the Q&A box that I would like to give you. It is about why Russia is still a member of the UN after everything that is going on.
All the easy questions. First, to say that we as members of the United Nations itself, people that work in the Secretariat or for the different organizations, we are carrying out and implementing the work of the United Nations, which is based upon the different treaties that have been agreed upon, the different mandates of the different organizations. From a humanitarian side, we work on ensuring that people in need, wherever they are, provide assistance to the people that need it. The United Nations itself is a treaty organization. It's member states who have entered into a treaty. It's been ratified by their parliaments. They've all come together to agree to work with each other. For a country to be expelled from the United Nations, it would have to be agreed upon by the member states. It's not for us as people working for the United Nations to decide on who are members, who are not members. We don't recognize states. States are welcomed by other states, by governments of the different states. And so I don't think there's any cases that I can think of where a country has been expelled from the UN. The UN is one place where people can come together to talk about and mediate disputes. Of course, there's been many cases throughout the history of the UN since 1945 when it was established, where one state has attacked another. In no cases has any of these countries been expelled from the UN, because once they're outside an area of cooperation and coordination, then you don't have another venue for people to come together. So I wouldn't expect that Russia would be expelled from the United Nations. But that being said, it doesn't mean there aren't systems within the UN to ensure that there can be censure and sanction on organizations. But of course, as a permanent member of the Security Council, the way the UN has been structured and set up, Russia has a special status along with the other 4 permanent members, and it's very difficult to make any changes of these bodies. Of course, there's been a movement to do a reform of the Security Council. But again, from a humanitarian perspective, we as members of the humanitarian community have nothing to do with that. We have no influence on it. And what we focus on is ensuring that those people who have been infected by conflict or violence have the assistance they need, no matter civilians, no matter what side they're on, because civilians and people in need all have the right to receive the assistance that they require.
Many thanks, James. That was very, very helpful. There was one question, and I see Karim has just responded to that, asking for contact details if people want to learn more and provide input to the tracker specifically. So in case anybody else is also interested in that, maybe Karim, if you can also drop your contact details and the team's contact details in the chat, so it's easier to find for everyone.
Actually, if you don't mind, I'll just quickly say, Tina, for everybody here, we're going to send an email just after this meeting with links for more information, with our contact details as well. So all of that will be available to all of you. And I know we're just over time now, so I'll just make a quick pitch as well. There's one other session that is coming up next week, and Tina will say something more about it, I'm sure. But it is, I think, important for businesses, Ukrainian businesses especially, who are interested in or are already supporting the humanitarian response, to become familiar in more detail with the rules and principles and standards that govern humanitarian response. We will be having a workshop on exactly that topic next week, and it is a good opportunity to better understand the structure of the UN, why, for example, a permanent Security Council exists, why we can't make those adjustments as humanitarian staff. And it may be an interesting opportunity for all of you to come in as well and discuss those topics in more detail. But for my part, just thank you very much again. And I do want to say thank you to all of you, both for what you're doing for your own people, your society, your employees, your customers. Thank you for working through a very, very difficult time. And we're inspired by you, and we appreciate what you're doing. Over to you, Tina.
Thanks, Karim. I know we're 2 minutes over time, but very quickly, I would like to respond to the last question and actually direct that to James. There's a question about whether there are programs that provide help with building materials for people whose houses were totally ruined. And there is a program from the Red Cross that this person is familiar with, but apparently only provides glass and roof materials for partially damaged houses. So James, I don't know if you have a program in mind, but maybe you can help us at least find the place where to ask that question.
Sure, no, absolutely. And I think the big question here is going to be on the kind of response and assistance that's provided. people whose house is damaged or destroyed wants to have the house rebuilt to the extent possible as it was before. Most of the humanitarian shelter response will provide something short of that. Lots of plastic sheeting, things to get through a winter to ensure that you are able to have a warm space during the winter period. We're about to launch an appeal for winterization programming. I think just last week, President Zelensky was highlighting the needs to be prepared for the winter, and being prepared for the winter is not just about shelter, but it's also about heating materials, it's about blankets, about winter clothing. There's a huge amount of needs, especially in those areas that had been occupied by the Russian forces and houses were destroyed. There's a huge amount of destruction in those areas, and certainly in those areas where are currently in conflict, where most people have fled, are of great concern. I would recommend, again, any organization going, and this is lead you back to the shelter cluster. The shelter cluster is focusing particularly on the issue of shelter and shelter repair. They have different standards and different partners that are working there, and we should be scaling up that shelter repair through the summer, and in order to ensure that there are lots of housing repairs before the winter. All that being said, it will fall short of the expectations, and the government itself is also working on a compensation program to ensure that the people whose houses have been damaged or destroyed receive funding assistance in order to either buy new houses or to make those repairs. So I think the first place to go would be, again, back to humanitarianresponse.info, find the contacts for the shelter cluster and start to engage there. And you can learn more about the ongoing programming from different partners. The biggest actors on the UN side are the International Organization of Migration and the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. They're the big UN agencies that work on shelter, but there are also many NGOs that are international NGOs that are providing shelter assistance. Over.
Many thanks, James. I think, Nara, if you want to just put up the last slide, we can also remain here in this view, if that's okay as well. I do want to thank our speakers, Tatiana, James, Karim, for their insights, and our participants for their very active participation. Thank you for the questions. Thank you for the comments. As has been highlighted now several times, we will host the last session of the webinar series on the 23rd of June, so next week, and we hope to see many of you there learning and discussing about critical principles and standards for humanitarian response. If you're unsure how to get started or you would like to find new UN partners, we have referred to a couple of websites. We will share all the presentation and the slides, but also some contact details in the thank you email after this webinar. But you know you can always reach out to us at the CBI, at OCHA, or the Global Compact Network in Ukraine. And maybe in closing very quickly, I just want to again reiterate that coordination between actors is really important in improving the scale and the overall quality of humanitarian response. As James highlighted, it helps us in identifying needs, addressing gaps, reducing duplication, which is significant, and it helps in clarifying the roles and responsibilities among different actors. After all of this, it helps us expand the scope and, most importantly, the impact of the interventions with the limited resources that we have available. So now, thank you again for having taken the time to join this session today. Take care, everyone. Stay safe and have a nice day. Bye.
Bye-bye.